Anyone who believes in indefinite growth on a physically finite planet is either mad or an economist.
We don't want to focus politics on a notion that involves the rejection of principles around which a large majority of our fellow citizens organize their lives.
We are not as endlessly manipulable and as predictable as you would think.
UKIP, or the UK Independence Party, is the most significant new party for a generation. It stands opposite our three Goliath parties, each of which can trace their roots back over a century. And it operates in a system that stacks the deck against new challenger parties. But despite those obstacles, UKIP is currently winning over more than 1 in 10 voters, and it's likely to attract over 1 in 4 at the European elections in May. They've pushed themselves to the front of our political debate. And to find a challenger as significant, you probably want to go back to the Social Democratic Party or the SDP in the early 1980s. But of course that comparison is not really fair, because the SDP was established by 4 Labour politicians who already had access to the corridors of power. That was a revolt from above. UKIP's is very much a revolt from below among specific social groups. And as I'll try and convince you over the next 30 minutes, this revolt really does matter. And unfortunately, it's also a revolt that is completely misunderstood. Now, if you looked at the wider debate in Britain, you'd actually think that we had a pretty good grasp of what's going on. The sudden arrival of this new party, we're repeatedly told, is merely a reflection of enduring divisions within the Conservative Party over Britain's EU membership. UKIP is a second home for middle-class Conservatives who live out in the shires and between rounds of golf spend their time complaining about the costs of the EU and longing for the days when Margaret Thatcher handbagged the Eurocrats. To top it off, now these Conservatives have David Cameron as their leader, a so-called Conservative who does not share their passion for withdrawing from Britain, but instead has thrown himself into supporting equal marriage and climate change. Now, this conventional wisdom that frames UKIP as merely a Conservative splinter group is understandable. That is where UKIP came from in 1993 as an anti-EU single-issue pressure group. But this image of UKIP as merely a collection of Conservatives in exile is actually now so well entrenched that even progressive social democrats are cheering on the rise of UKIP, confident that it is a useful tool that they can use to undermine the right. But the thing about conventional wisdoms is that they are often wrong. And the thing about political parties is that they often change. This revolt on the right is far more complex than we think, and its roots can be traced back over decades. This story, at least in very broad terms, starts here, with the decline of several groups in British society that we loosely term the left behind. Financially insecure, anxious Britons in blue-collar jobs who sought protection in trade unions, relied on the state for council housing, who had no educational qualifications because they left school at the earliest opportunity. Now, in the era that this chart takes us back to, Harold Wilson and the swinging 60s, these left-behind groups dominated society. And as a consequence, they were large enough to dominate the minds of our political parties and politicians, who ignored them at their peril. But since then, and in only 50 years, their numbers have dwindled. Now, if we flip this coin, we can see how the decline of the left behind has been mirrored by the rise of very different groups in our society. The more financially secure, professional, university-educated, middle-class voters. And it is these graduates, homeowners and more prosperous voters who now dominate, and as a consequence, have found themselves the subject of campaigns at election time. So in only 50 years, and I'm painting some very broad strokes here, Britain has been transformed from a society where low-skilled, low-educated, blue-collar voters decided elections to one where these left-behind groups have arguably now just become spectators in battles for the professional middle-class vote. This broad social change really matters, not just because it has transformed Britain's economic structure, but because it has changed the values that guide our society. Put simply, those who were left behind by Britain's economic transformation since the 1970s, who were then hit the hardest by the financial crisis and austerity, hold a very different outlook to those with the skills and resources to adapt and compete in the global economy. And importantly for this talk, this divide in values is especially striking when we look at the core radical right offer to voters on issues like Europe, national identity, immigration, and attitudes towards our politics. And as I will show you, this debate that has opened up has also grown since the financial crisis. So let's take a look at these divisions. First, let's look at our attitudes towards whether Britain should leave the European Union, which is the core founding issue for UKIP. Now, since the mid-1990s, the left-behind groups have been around 2 or 3 times as likely as the university-educated middle class to say, I agree, Britain should withdraw from the European Union. But as you can see, this divide has also grown since the crisis. At the top are those low-skilled workers in Britain who were never sold on the idea of European integration, and the crisis has just intensified that opposition. In sharp contrast, at the bottom, those professional, university-educated, middle-class voters, they've become more sceptical since the crisis, but actually large majorities continue to hold positive views of Europe, and if they don't, chances are they can be persuaded to accept our membership. Now, the differences do not stop there. If I were to show you how these attitudes change across generations, then we would see a similarly sharp divide. Those older Britons who were born before Britain joined the European Union are the most likely to say, yep, we should leave the EU. But those born after 1975, far more positive in their attitudes. And this divide extends also to how we see immigration, currently the second most important issue for voters. The left-behind groups, again, have a very different outlook. This chart is showing you the number of voters, or the percentage of voters, who spontaneously mention immigration as one of the most important problems facing Britain. And you can see, again, a sharp and clear divide across these two very broad groups. At the top, those older, blue-collar, less well-educated, left-behind voters, and at the bottom, those from the middle class who went to university and who were born since 1970. And of course, you might notice 2 other things about this chart. Look at when concern over immigration peaks, before the collapse of the Lehman Brothers and before the financial crisis. But also, look at how those concerns are sharpening now as the crisis subsides. Among secure and privileged groups, the issue of immigration has not returned to the forefront of their minds to the same extent